The Shot Heard Round the World. Thomas Fleming. For 7 years, beginning in 1775, America and Britain waged an all-out war. The arrogant British had imposed unjust taxes on the colonists, closed a prize port, and taken away America's personal rights. The colonists were forced to fight for their freedom from the richest, most powerful nation in the world. This three-part series focuses on the American Revolution's major battles. In the gray dawn of April 1975, 16-year-old William Diamond beat vigorously on his drum. About 78 members of the Lexington, Massachusetts Militia Company formed two uneven lines on the grassy common in the center of town. Soon the Americans heard the thud of hundreds of feet striking the ground. Around one side of the Lexington church came a British Army officer on horseback waving a sword. Around the other side of the church came 6 companies of red-coated light infantry, about 350 men. Another 400 soldiers were on the road not far behind them. The infantry raced toward the Americans, shouting furiously. The officer with the sword roared, "Lay down your arms!" Another officer bellowed, "Disperse, you rebels!" Route at Lexington on to Concord. Tensions were high. The Americans were trying to avoid firing the first shots, but they wanted the British to know they were ready to fight if they were forced. Thinking the British soldiers had orders not to fire if the Americans remained peaceful, the Lexington men began to scatter quietly. Then someone fired, and the British soldiers answered with a full volley. Young Isaac Muzzy died at his father's feet. Jonathan Harrington crawled to his own doorstep and died in front of his horrified wife and son. Old Jonas Parker was killed by a British. By the time British officers got their soldiers under control, 8 Lexington men were dead and 10 were wounded. With fifes whistling and drums beating, the 750 British marched toward Concord for a day of fighting neither side would forget. The British are coming! Riding Brown Beauty, one of the fastest horses in Massachusetts Boston, silversmith Paul Revere warned Lexington of the British plan to raid Lexington and Concord. 2 American leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, were staying in Lexington. The Americans feared the British might seize the 2 men as well as the cannon and gunpowder in Concord. It would take a breakneck midnight ride to get the word out. Revere crossed the Charles River and rode from Charlestown. Another writer, Tanner William Dawes, rode across Boston Neck and arrived in Lexington a half hour after Revere. In 1863, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow made Paul Revere's famous with a poem, Paul Revere's Ride. Longfellow's poem never mentioned Dawes. We will be reading this poem next week. Fight to protect property and liberty. The quarrel between England and 13 American colonies had been building for 10 years. The British Parliament claimed that they had the right to tax the Americans. The Americans believed that if they didn't protest, their property and liberty would vanish. The Americans defied every tax passed by the British government. They even resisted a 3-cent a pound tax on tea. On December 16, 1773, disguised as Mohawk Indians, Bostonians threw $48,295 worth of tea, worth about $3 million today, into the harbor. To punish the Americans for the Boston Tea Party, the British closed the port and sent almost 3,000 troops to make sure it stayed shut. From then on, the royal governor of Massachusetts, appointed by the king, would run everything and everyone. The people of Massachusetts knew they had to defend their liberty. They began collecting cannon and gunpowder at Concord, 20 miles from Boston. Defending Concord, by April 1775, the British had had enough. They mustered the army and shot their way through Lexington, then marched toward Concord to seize the war materials. There, the British stationed 3 companies of infantry, about 120 men, at the North Bridge over the Concord River, where they searched for the well-hidden powder and cannon. About 400 Concord men marched towards the soldiers to drive them out of their town. The British fired volley. Bullets struck one militiaman in the head, another in the heart. The Concord men fired back. They killed 2 British privates and a sergeant and wounded 4 officers. The rest of the British ran for their lives. A bloody road. Americans came from all directions to stop the British retreat towards Boston. At Merriam's Corner, American Minutemen shot at the British from side stone walls and buildings. Soon, one Minuteman said, a great many British lay dead and the road was so bloody. The British sent flanking parties into the fields to charge the Americans with bayonets. The Minutemen raced ahead of the British column to set up another ambush. The British began to panic. It seemed like men dropped from clouds, one soldier said, as they re-entered Lexington. Another blast of bullets hit them. It was the men of Lexington Company, eager for revenge. Suddenly, the soldiers at the head of the British column began to cheer. There were 1,000 fresh men in Lexington Commons, reinforcements sent from Boston. They had begun it. We will end it. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of Massachusetts' leaders, took command of the Americans late in the day. They had begun it. We will end it, he said. Militia and Minutemen. During colonial times, every man between the ages of 16 and 60 served in his colonial's militia, also known as the Army. This part-time soldiers met once a year to train and drill. When the British sent an army to Boston, the rebel government of Massachusetts required a third of the militia to become Minutemen, special forces ready to fight at a minute's notice. Massachusetts' 15,000 Minutemen trained 3 or 4 times a week. The value of that training was proven on April 19, 1775, at Lexington and Concord. The Battle of Bunker Hill. Just after midnight on June 17, 1775, the Americans began to build a fort on Breed's Hill. It was part of Bunker Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula, Charlestown Peninsula across the Charles River from Boston. Spies had discovered a British plan to attack the American army outside Boston. The Americans decided to choose the place where they would fight rather than wait for the British. That afternoon, 2,500 British attacked the fort and the rail fence the Americans had built outside it. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, American Colonel Israel Putnam ordered. Shooting at point-blank range, the Americans killed or wounded 1,150 British regulars. The Americans lost 450 people. The battle made the British realize the American Revolution was not to be easy to crush. By now, the Americans had more than 4,000 men. A half hour later, when the 1,750 British resumed their retreat to Boston, we were fired on from all quarters, one officer said. Up ahead, other Americans fortified the town of Metamonte, now called Arlington. They put men behind stone walls and at windows and doors. When the British marched down the street, the big battle erupted. The British split into squads and attacked every fortified building. All that we found in the house were put to death, said one British lieutenant. In one house, 11 Americans died in brutal hand-to-hand fighting that raged from the cellar to the attic. In the streets, the regiment at the rear of the British column soon lost so many men it had to be replaced by the Royal Marines. Swarms of bullets hurtled in all directions as British fired volleys and dodging Minutemen. Muskets in the twilight. Beyond Metamonte, the Americans tried to force the British to retreat through Cambridge. They destroyed the bridge across the Charles River and hoped to trap the British against the deep stream. But the British used cannon to force their way down the road to Charlestown on a peninsula access to Charles River from Boston. In the twilight, their tired soldiers trudged along the peninsula's narrow neck to high ground on Bunker Hill. They had lost 273 men that day. The Americans had only lost 100. The Royal Marines set up a rugged defense in Charlestown. In one of the last fights, the British saw a militiaman fall. He was one of the men from Lexington, still trying to get even for friends who had died that morning. The Lexington men joined the American army that formed outside Boston to make sure the British did not march out again. Soon, a soldier from Virginia, George Washington, took command of the army. There was no holding back now. The Revolutionary War between America and the British had begun. The Great Declaration. On July 4th, 1776, more than a year after the battles of Lexington and Concord, Montgomery and Bunker Hill, the Americans officially declared their independence from Britain. In their Declaration of Independence, they said they were fighting for three things: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They declared that every man and woman possessed these rights from birth, no matter what any king or parliament said. The Declaration of Independence became the most important document in American history. It told why Americans had launched their revolution. It explained the kind of country they hoped to create. And it empowered them to continue the bloody fight against the Britons.